Thank you so much, Mary Hancock, for that welcome and your remarks. I'm Hunter Hook, Vice President of Water and Community Facilities Banking Group from CoBank, one of the largest providers of finance and credit for rural infrastructure and agribusiness in America. We are proud to be a presenting sponsor of Water in the West 2020. Water in the West has proven to be a unique event, bringing together voices from industry, agriculture, and government in ways that advance the work on water that we know must be central to sustainable growth in the West. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gary Knell, Chairman of National Geographic Partners. Prior to various roles at National Geographic, Mr. Knell served as President and CEO of National Public Radio. He also spent 22 years at Sesame Workshop, where he served as President and CEO for 12. Prior to Sesame Workshop, Knell worked in publishing and television and in state and national government. Mr. Knell has a BA in political science from UCLA and a JD from Loyola University of Los Angeles. Mr. Knell joins us today from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Mr. Knell, for launching Water in the West 2020, and we look forward to your remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to kick off this year's Water in the West Symposium. I'd like to thank Jocelyn Hittel and Secretary Tom Vilsack for the opportunity to speak today. While I wish that we could gather in person, I'm grateful to everyone at CSU Spur who worked so hard to make this important conversation possible. National Geographic's connection to the American West, and specifically to water issues in the region, can be traced back more than 150 years. In fact, it predates the birth of National Geographic itself. In 1869, a one-armed explorer named John Wesley Powell embarked on a dangerous journey. With a crew of 10 men and 4 wooden rowboats, Powell set out from the Green River of Wyoming and into what was then called the Great Unknown. 99 days and more than 900 miles later, after a series of disasters and near-death experiences, Powell emerged from the mouth of the Grand Canyon, having completed the first known descent of the Colorado River. As a result of that daring expedition, Powell became a national hero, and he became one of America's leading experts on the geography and geology of the West. And in 1888, he became one of 33 co-founders of a new organization dedicated to the increase and diffusion of geographic knowledge, called the National Geographic Society. In the following years, the scope of the Society's work rapidly expanded, but Powell by then was primarily focused on a single issue: water. He advocated for drawing state lines in the West based on watershed areas, creating his now famous watershed map to support his case. And in a speech to the National Irrigation Congress of 1893, as fellow speakers enthusiastically celebrated the development of the West, he issued a dire and prophetic warning. Quote, "You are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply these lands," unquote. Powell's warning is becoming a reality as we speak. You've all heard the statistics. Over the past century, the average annual flow of the Colorado River, which some 40 million people depend on for water, has declined by 20%. Over the past 2 decades, up to half of that decline can be attributed to climate change, resulting in some 1.5 billion tons of missing water. Scientists now believe that America's 2 largest man-made reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are increasingly likely to see water shortages by 2025. And this is all happening against the backdrop of a global water crisis that is too often overlooked. Today, an estimated 785 million people around the world lack access to clean drinking water. More than 2 billion live in countries experiencing high water stress. And as climate change accelerates, those numbers will only continue to rise unless we act now. The question we face is how to address this crisis before it's too late. While there are no easy answers, we do have some key tools at our disposal. Clearly, policy has an important role to play. So do new technologies and innovations. But I believe that one of the most important tools we have, one that can inspire the policymakers and innovators to act, is storytelling. At National Geographic, we believe that great stories can transform the way people understand the world and our role in it. And we know that understanding is essential because our experience has taught us that when people understand the world, they care more deeply for it. Over the past 132 years, we have seen the incredible power of storytelling to shape narratives, influence policies, and drive progress on the issues that we care about. Here's one example. In 1915, National Geographic editor Gilbert H. Grosvenor traveled to the Sierra Nevada on a trip organized by Stephen Mather, a wealthy businessman who was trying to drum up support for a new federal agency to manage America's national parks. Until then, Grosvenor had never been west of Ohio. He was so inspired by what he saw that he devoted an entire issue of the magazine to the story of America's scenic wonders, encouraging readers to support the creation of a park service. That issue was published the following April and was sent to every member of Congress as they considered a bill that Grosvenor helped draft to establish the new agency. A few months later, the legislation passed, and the National Park Service was born. Or take a more recent example. As many of you know, the Okavango Delta is the largest freshwater wetland in southern Africa. It's a haven for wildlife of all kinds, including the world's largest remaining elephant population, and is the main source of water for more than 1 million people. For the past 5 years, the Okavango Wilderness Project, led by National Geographic fellow Dr. Steve Boys, has been surveying the river system and working to protect the greater Okavango Basin. In 2018, we released a feature documentary about their efforts called Into the Okavango. The film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and was seen by delegations from the governments of Angola, Namibia, and Botswana. In the wake of the premiere, the Angolan government signed numerous agreements with the Okavango Wilderness Project in support of creating a new national park. The film was also screened on Capitol Hill, and in December 2018, Congress approved the Delta Act, bipartisan legislation calling on the U.S. government to develop a strategy for protecting the Okavango. So we know that great storytelling can make a difference. And we are committed to using our platforms at National Geographic to tell stories that needed attention to the water crisis in the American West. In April 2010, we dedicated an entire special issue to global water issues that included a feature story on threats to the water supply in California. In the decades since, we have returned to this important story repeatedly, striving to put a human face on the challenge while chronicling its vast impact across the West. Among other topics, we have explored how shrinking snowpacks are affecting farmers in the Central Valley. We've reported on the inspiring efforts that conservationists and community leaders have undertaken to restore parts of the Colorado River Delta. And we have examined the significant impact of beef production on western rivers, including in the Colorado River Basin itself, where more than half of the water consumed goes to irrigating crops that are used to feed beef and dairy cattle. A few years ago, we also released the Emmy-nominated documentary Water and Power from director Marina Zenovich, which drew comparisons to Chinatown with its portrayal of the forces influencing California's water policies. And we're not just telling the story of water in the West, we are actively working to change it through our work with our nonprofit arm, the National Geographic Society. In conjunction with our special water issue, we named our first ever freshwater fellow, Sandra Postel, who guided our water efforts for more than 5 years. During her time at National Geographic, she helped to launch an initiative called Change the Course, which has restored billions of gallons of water to depleted ecosystems in the Colorado River Basin. Over the past few years, we have also awarded grants to researchers who are studying a variety of related issues, from the impacts of climate change on small lakes in Wyoming's Medicine Bow Mountains to water access and sustainability in Mexico City. National Geographic will continue working to tell and shape the story of water in the West. We are determined to be a part of the solution. But it's important to understand powerful storytelling doesn't just happen in magazines and movies. As the people closest to this issue, each of you has the ability to tell stories that do make an impact, stories that illuminate the challenges we face and inspire people to act. You just need to know how. With that in mind, I would like to share a few core principles that guide our storytelling at National Geographic and that you can use too. First, we believe there is no better way to understand the world than to see it for yourself. That's why we always try to include a strong visual element in our work. Of course, National Geographic has long been known for our photography. It's why people save copies of our magazines for years after reading them, and why we now have more than 145 million followers on Instagram, more than at least 2 of the Kardashians, I might add. But you don't have to be a National Geographic photographer to show people the world. With a smartphone and an internet connection, you can document what you're seeing in your work, and you can help people see the challenges more clearly than they did before. Second, the most persuasive stories appeal to the commonalities between us, not our differences. Even in these incredibly divisive times, National Geographic has loyal fans in blue states and red states, in coastal cities and across the heartland. One of the big reasons why is that while we stand unequivocally on the side of science, we make a concerted effort to emphasize the universal nature of the issues we cover and how they connect to the lived experiences of diverse audiences everywhere. And there is perhaps no issue more universal than water. We are also able to reach people across the spectrum because they trust that National Geographic will always provide them with accurate information. That brings me to my third and final principle: factual authenticity. In today's age of dwindling attention spans, there's a tendency to assume that facts belong primarily in the domain of science, while storytelling requires a more sensationalistic approach. That couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the best stories take the relevant facts and present them in ways that people can visualize, in ways that people can identify with on a personal level. To put differently, what the best stories do is present the facts in ways that deep down people can understand. Take it from another iconic National Geographic explorer, the inimitable Dr. Jane Goodall, who said, "What you have to do is get to the heart. And how do you get there? With stories." Jane knows from experience. She celebrated her 86th birthday in April. And before the pandemic, she was still traveling the world and telling her story more than 300 days a year because she has seen the incredible impact that they make. By embracing the power in your own stories, you too can get to people's hearts. You can change their minds. And together, we can change the world. As Jane so memorably put it, only if we understand will we care. Only if we care will we help. Only if we help shall all be saved. Now, I'm pleased to be joined by Secretary Vilsack to answer some of your questions. Thanks so much for having me.
Gary, let me first of all, on behalf of all of us who are involved in this symposium, thank you for a remarkable set of comments. Couldn't have been a better keynote to get this symposium launched, and really appreciate you taking the time to answer a few questions after your speech. And I'll try to weave in some of the points that you made during the speech, but let me begin by focusing on the fact that, as is the case with National Geographic, I will tell you that my family, we get 3 or 4 subscriptions, and depending upon our interests, a slightly different way in which you communicate with your subscribers. You recognize that there are different audiences and that you have to make slight adjustments. So when we talk about water, we obviously have to talk about it in terms of the audiences that we have to convince and we have to move to action. Especially young people. And you've had some experience with, in a prior life when you worked on Sesame Street with telling stories to young people. Talk a little bit about how you would suggest and give us advice about how to approach different audiences, utilizing the visual factors you talked about, focusing on the commonality as you spoke of, and making sure that we bring the facts to life in a way that's persuasive. So how do you do it?
Well, thanks. And thank you, Tom. And thanks everyone at CSU for having me. It's an honor to be here, and all of you who are tuning in. Thank you for your important work. You wouldn't be here if you didn't care about this really important issue. You know, I like to quote Joan Gans Cooney, who was the founder of Sesame Street, Tom, who talked about the fact when she founded Sesame Street, the realization that it wasn't a question of whether television was teaching, it was a question of what was it teaching. And I think you could apply that to all media, as we've learned even in a political context through, you know, what news and entertainment have kind of come together into creating kind of some of the havoc we have in our country right now. So I think, you know, this is really about having to reach people rather than preach at people. And then you can teach people. It's really a teaching mechanism that you've got to be thinking about. And I always would like to start, Tom, with what is the end game? I think sometimes we try to think about, well, I've got to get in all these points so I can tell everyone what they need to hear, rather than what is the end game that you want people to get to. And I mean, we can talk about this, but these issues of water are quite complex. You know, this is an economic development issue for many, many people. And this is a conservation issue for many, many people. It's an environmental issue. So we've got to sort of figure out what is nirvana here. What is the point where everyone in this meeting, where do they want to get to, and then sort of come back from that, which is what we try to do at National Geographic. You know, the issue in December is going to be about the Great Lakes region, which is suffering some parallel issues with what's happening out in the Western water issues. And this is about, you know, what's going to happen through climate change, through pollution, through wildlife, and all of the issues that people are dependent on in the upper Midwest about the Great Lakes. So we're trying to come to some place where we can educate a population in a nonpartisan way that can get people to have an aha moment on their own.
Well, that's interesting because part of your speech focused on the importance of building trust. And obviously building trust takes time. But how do you balance taking the time to build the trust with the urgency of the moment? My former boss used to talk about the fierce urgency of now. Water issues, we obviously have not had the fierce urgency of now until perhaps recently. How do we accelerate the process, but at the same time, spend the time to build the trust that will allow it to actually work?
Yeah, well, I think you've got to build some benchmarks and milestones. You know, I mean, if you think about the world we're living in now with COVID, I mean, if a lot of people in the country aren't feeling urgent about this, what are they going to feel urgent about? You have to ask yourself. And I think things like climate change, as an example, I think the environmental movement is at a very difficult time making that an urgent topic for people other than who are really leaning into that issue. And I think we've got to find a way to think about this as a generational issue. Think about what is the world that we want our kids to inherit from us. So much of America is founded on the American dream concept, right? And so much of our political schism, I think, is interpretations of that dream as an opportunity or a right. And I think in this case, it's really, you know, how do we figure out a way to to have the American dream, which is still kind of wrapped up in a conservation ethic, which for many years, as you know, Tom, from your home state of Iowa, this is the most bipartisan issue there was, conservation. And somehow we've lost the ability to bring that in as a core conservative ethic in this country, or an ethic for that progressives and conservatives can come together around. And I think we've got to figure out a way to make that happen so that we can build that classroom, let's say, of the public in a more urgent way to drive at some really important changes that have to be made, that people can measure, that they can see change. And that we got work to do.
Well, we do have work to do. And you mentioned the notion of not preaching to people, but teaching people. And we have a tendency, I think, sometimes in some of these issues to be a little preachy about them. But at the same time, we also want to make sure people understand fully and completely the challenge. And also at the same time, we want to make sure that people are aware that actually steps are being taken, progress is being made. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how you strike the balance between making sure people understand fully and completely the challenge that we face without being so discouraged that they feel that, well, there's no reason to even try because the problem is too big. And at the same time, provide examples, concrete examples of progress that is being made so that people do see, oh, I see, there's a pathway to getting some of these big problems solved. How would you strike that balance? What advice would you give us for that?
Well, let me tell you about the photo arc. I think that's a perfect example. We have a photographer named Joel Sartori. He lives in neighboring Lincoln, Nebraska. He's a Nebraska native. And Joel is photographing the 15,000 species currently in the world in captivity. And some of these are literally down to the 4 or 5 final individuals in this particular species, like the white rhino as an example. But he's taking them in a way, capturing them beautifully through something called the photo arc, which is modeled after Noah's Ark, of course. And this concept of pushing this out there in this beautiful way, Tom, is a way of getting people to open their eyes about species and about endangered species and what is left and our responsibility. You talk about reaching kids who then reach their parents. This is a beautiful way, and it's been an incredibly effective way. He's a regular on 60 Minutes, on CBS Sunday Morning. He's had exhibits in many zoos around the country and around the world. And he's brought that ethic now to awaken people to the issue of endangered species and conservation in a way that it doesn't feel offensive to me. In fact, people just gather around at the beauty of what this is trying to preserve. And I think that's a perfect example. We have others, the Pristine Seas Project, which Enrique Sala has done, which is trying to protect marine protected areas around the world. And what he's trying to do, frankly, is work with different political leaders around the world, whether it's the president of Ecuador or the prime minister of the UK, to get them almost in a bake-off of who can do more to protect some of the last wild places so that we're not, as he likes to say, writing the obituary of the ocean. So a lot of this depends on presenting this in a way that doesn't feel like you're criticizing someone. It's almost like you're awakening them and their family. So their kids are also completely into this. And as you know, kids can be the greatest advocate and can move the dial on many social issues by just their emotion, because they don't have these kinds of filters that we do as adults.
You know, Gary, I've got one question that I always feel that when I do interviews like this, that people need to get to know the person, you as a person. Obviously, you're passionate about your work, and you spoke about the power of story, embracing that power of story. How did you, in your life, come to become such an advocate for storytelling? What was it about your early life? What was it about your professional life that led you to have such a passion for not only telling a story, but telling it well?
Well, I think part of it is I grew up in Southern California, sort of in the shadow of Hollywood. So I can remember as a young child seeing, the Roman army coming over the hillside with my dad driving in the car. Talk about that is really called rubbernecking. So, and living through movies, it basically showed me a world that was so much broader than the little narrow world that I happened to that I grew up in. So that ability, storytelling, and just moving me emotionally towards caring about issues, civil rights issues, environmental issues, people involved in other issues around the world, human rights issues. So all of these things, I think I kind of came awareness.
And I had a real passion around journalism, I think, as a young student, and through middle school, high school, and then college. So I was able to, craft that, Tom, into storytelling that then sort of took me into the executive ranks, so I could try to corral storytellers and provide resources for them to do their work. And that's how I view my job today.
You have had and are currently working in two of the greatest jobs in America. Your work at Sesame Street and your work for National Geographic. I want to take this opportunity again to thank you for sharing your passion, sharing your insight and your advice and counsel with us. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to weave into the balance of this symposium. So we are indebted to you, and looking forward to the next edition of National Geographic.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone in Colorado and everyone on the symposium. Thanks for what you're doing every day. It's super important, and count us in as a partner.